Everyone, it's early in the morning here in London, so let's start the day off right by talking about death. Today we're going to be talking about Victorian era death practices and the old good death. Victorian era death practices were rather extreme, especially by today's standards. Today, if somebody dies in your family, you get bereavement pay. If you get bereavement leave, you get like 4 or 5 days if it's somebody like your spouse or your kid or your mother, and you get 2 or 3 days if it's anybody else. The Victorians would have thrown a hissy fit if you got 2 or 3 days to bereave somebody. These people took 6 months to grieve, which is honorable and nice, but a little extreme. The Victorian era death practices had mourning periods of 6 months, so you started with 3 months of mourning, heavy mourning, full mourning, and this mourning women would wear long dresses all the way down to the ends of their arms. They would wear the high ruff that covered all of their neck. They would wear a veil that covered their whole face, and generally looked like sad, depressed people because they were sad, depressed people. They mourned for 6 months, guys. So, during this period, they usually wouldn't cook. People would cook for them. They usually wouldn't clean. Only the high-class people, the lower-class people, didn't get this luxury. They would wear all black. They wouldn't show any skin. They wouldn't go out. They would not leave the house unless they absolutely had to. They would decorate the house with chrysanthemums, which were flowers that represented death. And they would generally not do anything for 6 months. After the full 3 months of full mourning, they went into mourning light. Now in mourning light, women could wear 3/4 length or half length sleeves. They could wear a little bit of lace instead of like a full collar. They could wear things that only went down to their ankles instead of all the way down to the ground. I know. Really immodest, guys. Showing a bit of ankle. And then after that, full 3 months, they would go back to whatever they wanted to do. So 3 months full mourning, 3 months light mourning, normal life. Unless you're Queen Victoria. So after the death of Prince Albert, King Albert. After the death of King Albert, her husband, in 1850, Queen Victoria went into mourning for the rest of her life. This kind of followed fashion with the high nobility. Everyone else hated it. The news said that she was secluded and wasn't doing her duties, which was true, and the poor people thought that she was just abusing her right as queen to not do any work. Now, in modern times, we would say that she was depressed. Back then, they said, oh no, it's honorable. She's mourning her husband because of her great loss and their great love. She kind of kept everything how it was when he died. She didn't remove any of his belongings. She kept his room exactly how it was. She didn't let anybody clean or touch anything. And she wore full mourning until the end of her life. Except for in her period of dotage, when her grandchildren were coming of age, when they were like 7 to 8, then she changed from full mourning to full mourning plus like the big long bridal gown that women wore in their dotage. This kind of set a style, but all the young people thought it was hip and cool to wear full mourning. Oddly enough, they would get glamour shots done with like them and their best friends in mourning gear, like all looking at a crystal ball. This was also when we saw the rise of Ouija boards, because it would be a big event. There'd be a full table Ouija board, not the little ones that we have today. And they would go, and they would all have tea, have a big thing, have a medium come in, commune with the dead. Real weird. But they were having their time. It was fun. It was fashionable. Whatnot. This changed after World War I. After World War I, they finally put away the Ouija boards and the full mourning gowns. Whew, that was long. 65 years where that was the style. That's a lot. That's too much. On to the Good Death. So, the Good Death was created by a Catholic monk in the Middle Ages, and it was called the Ars Moriendi, which means the art of dying. It was 2 books. Well, they were not books, they were huge-ass tomes. And they told you how to die well. It was called the Christian Art of Dying Well. And at this point, secularism hadn't really arisen in Europe or America, so this was the be-all, end-all of how to die well. So in order to die well, in order to have a good death, you needed to die of natural causes. So natural causes for them would be disease, it would be cancer, it would be old age, organ failure, all of that. It would not be a violent death. If you died a violent death, you did not die a good death. That lasted in America until the Civil War, and that lasted in England until World War One. After that, they kind of gave up on that because we had massive casualties through the invention of the machine gun and all the other explosives and bombs that we had during World War One. And they went, wow, are all of our millions of people dying bad deaths when they're serving our country? They decided no, they weren't dying bad deaths, then that it was honorable to die in battle. You also died whole in order to die a good death at this time. If you had any sort of amputation or anything rot off from disease, you did not die a good death because you did not die whole. This lasted until the 1950s when the Pope made a bull, a papal bull, that said the belief that you died poorly if you did not die intact went against church doctrine because it said that dying not intact made and that you couldn't come back said that God was not powerful enough to put you back together after death, and that kind of goes against the whole doctrine of God being the ultimate power. So they decided that that wasn't good enough. You also had to know that you were dying, which is opposite of what we do today. Nowadays, doctors usually won't tell a patient that they're dying, but in that time, they immediately told them that they were dying because it was believed after you died, you transformed and you could no longer tell a lie and you were serene and you didn't feel pain because you didn't care about this worldly world anymore. Nowadays, this led to a dying declaration, which is still admissible in court. You had to be stoic. You couldn't show any pain, even if you were dying of horrible, horrible pain and infection, or you were dying of gangrene or syphilis. All of these painful, painful deaths, you weren't allowed to show pain. If you showed pain, it meant that you weren't faithful, and it meant that you were dying a poor death and you were going to hell. It was the belief that whatever face you died with was the face that you would greet God with. And so if you greeted God with a painful face, he must assume that you died painfully and send you to hell. After you finally died, your body would be put in the parlor of the house, and it would be left there for about 3 days. During this time, it was a great ritual to see the body move from a fresh corpse, which looks very human, all the way down to a rotting deceased corpse, which did not look human. That's why they were a death-accepting culture, which we will talk about next week. After this 3-day vigil, you would finally have the funeral, where the family would carry the body on a pall to the grave, and then they would finally be buried. They would be buried in a family plot. If they weren't buried in a family plot, they were considered beggars, or they were considered pariahs. It meant that they didn't have any family, or that their family hated them. Thank you for tuning in. Come back next. Remember to like and subscribe. Come in next week where we'll talk about modern death practices, PAS, and the new good death.